Good evening and welcome to the Bangalore International Centre for this program in collaboration with the Glasshouse Festival by Art Mantram. This evening we present the fourth and final segment in our series, Beethoven Variations, with poet Ruth Padel and pianist Karl Lutchmayer. This segment is titled The Immortal Beloved, Despair and His Astonishing Late Style. This evening, Ruth and Karl will be joined by guest artists, soprano Nina Kanter and cellist David Waterman and the Endellion String Quartet. Ruth Padel.
When Beethoven was 41, he fell in love for the last time. We don't know who she was. People have written books about her for 200 years, wondering and trying to identify which woman it was in his life. We do have a letter in which he wrote to her in July 1812, in which he calls her his immortal beloved. She seems to have returned his love, but she was also unattainable, the theme of Beethoven's life, really. I wrote a poem about this letter, and I just want to read you a little bit from it because it is so touching. Never can another own my heart. Never. Oh God, why have to separate oneself from what one loves? My life in Vienna is a miserable life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and most unhappy. Only through quiet contemplation can we reach our goal to live together. Be patient. Love me. What longing with tears for you, my love, my all. Farewell. Well, we don't know what happened to the relationship, but I wrote a poem about this touching and famous letter. Forever yours, forever mine, forever us. Sometimes giving up what you love leads on to everything you wanted in your life, but that doesn't mean it wasn't loss. What remains is an echo, an afterglow from a night with a woman he loves. Maybe the only night he ever spent with anyone. A letter from a man who broke down on a midnight dash through a forest. A letter he maybe never sent and nobody saw until he died, and it was found in a secret drawer. A promise of eternal togetherness, a wishbone about to break. A letter of goodbye from a man aching to be touched, walking away from what means most to him, except his art, who wrote long after to his publisher, farewell is said only from the heart, and when you are alone. Well, that love affair and the end of it, whatever happened, initiated 3 or 4 years of misery for Beethoven. He read a lot, he was very alone, and he couldn't write. He was a composer who was not composing. The logjam was broken in 1816 when he started writing a series of songs. The lyricist, the poet, was a young Czechoslovakian doctor who was studying medicine in Vienna. And the songs are really a song cycle. It became the first song cycle in Western music. A ring, he called it a song ring, like a ring, a token of love. And in it, he imagines the songs, the music he's writing, wafting through the hills to his love, his distant love. So it joins in a way 2 things. One was the nature he always loved, and the other was this theme in his life of unattainable love. It is as if, because she was so far away now, perhaps in time, but also in space, his creativity was unlocked. To the distant beloved. Now she is far enough away, your heart can say what it wants. Just as the winding stream, meltwater, starless rivers, carried on flowing all winter under whistling silks of snow, when everything was a frozen dream, though When random flurries stirred, you could imagine soft little paw prints, a feather imping the surface, white on white, through processions of black trees. But the ice is relaxing now. Plates of it jostle near the banks, riding the flow of water dark and alive. And now she is far enough away, your heart can break through, say what it wants. The world is fluid, not fixed. It is as if she has died, carried on flowing all winter, and you can turn her into harmony, no matter if this is the flood of remembered love or the fire of making new. So here is the pianist Karl Lutchmayer to tell you a little about the music of An die ferne Geliebte.
When we listen to An die ferne Geliebte, we are aware of a sort of sublime simplicity. It's the same kind of simplicity that gets passed down to Schubert, and indeed we hear it in Beethoven's last style period, where everything is pared down. All is necessary, nothing is excess, and with a deft note here or a phrase there, he changes our emotional journey through the music. Beethoven, the great pianist, writes simple figurations as accompaniment to the song so that we hear the real journey of the singer and of the imaginary protagonist as he journeys through the landscape. And it's very interesting that this is, as Ruth says, the very first song cycle or song ring, something that's going to be so influential throughout the 19th century and Romanticism. But Beethoven really understands that it's a song ring, but it's also like the journey of a person, the journey of man, if you will. It takes us all the way round and ends up with the same melody it begins with.
After Beethoven had finished An die ferne Geliebte in 1816, he began hatching and evolving his famous late style, which was cosmic and radical and introspective, and quite grand. He wrote the Beethoven Variations for piano, his greatest piece for piano. He wrote the Missa Solemnis and said on it, From the heart may it go to the heart. He wrote the Ninth Symphony, and then in 1825 he started on his last quartets. He wrote the 3 he was commissioned to write, and then went on to write others. And first of all, Opus 131 in C sharp minor, which some people think is his greatest music of all. I was lucky enough to see the manuscript when I went to Krakow in Poland, and I'd like to share with you the poem I wrote about this extraordinary experience. On opening the manuscript of Opus 131 in Krakow. I never believed I'd meet him here, still less that my fingers could touch his touch on the page. Another chance to be new again. Does being deaf break the chains? Could he have written this otherwise? Fugue and variation lead to rebirth, regeneration. The initial theme transformed into 1,000 branches, all carrying the DNA of the first seed. Black cobweb crossings out, 5 sharps like wriggling insects. I can't imagine how any player could read this, but I recognize the voices, first solo, then together, now angry and loud, now gentle. I remember my father saying you could tell from this everything of the human. Yearning, loving, in despair, then calm. Amused and jokey, sotto voce, beyond loss. 3 bars slashed out, the way he wrote espressivo. Here, over pale lines of the stave, the famous tortured entries one by one. When the librarian isn't looking, I kiss the corner of the page. Well, let me introduce you to the cellist of the Endellion Quartet, which has played twice in Bangalore for the Music Society, and who has been playing this music for 40 years. This is David Waterman of the Endellion Quartet. So, David, it's really lovely to talk to you today about Opus 131, which for me is really the pinnacle of everything. Can you say a little about how your quartet approaches playing it?
I think over the years, I think one just aims to strip away everything that's unnecessary and just get to the core of what is, I don't know, in some way truthful for us. I mean, it's not a question of making it beautiful, it's a question of making it express exactly what is there, and no more and no less. And the music itself speaks volumes, and it goes so deep, and one just has to be taken by the music and become in some way a vehicle for the music. I mean, this applies to any piece really. There are particular issues with 131, one being that, and one thing which makes it wonderful is there are no breaks between the movements, and there are something like 7 movements if you include the small connecting movements. So as a question of focus and stamina, it's the build-up of playing it from beginning to end to an audience with no stopping at all is rather wonderful, I think, because you haven't really had time to dispel the emotion of one movement before the next movement just hits you, and you don't really draw breath in that way. And so the accumulation of strong emotion by the end is absolutely terrific for us as players as well as the audience.
And you told me once that one of the sort of extraordinary things about playing Beethoven is that there are tiny little seeds of ideas, musical ideas, that then get rearranged and developed and flower into all sorts of different things. Does that happen all the time? Actually,
fugal movements and the variation movements are particularly good examples of the way, you know, a motif at the beginning is the DNA of the whole movement, really. And Beethoven, is interesting that in his later period, Beethoven went back to these somewhat older forms, variation and fugue, and really took them to a completely new level. I think he was probably attracted by the economy of material, and as contrasted with the huge amount of flowering that he could get out of it. So he's just continuously inventing and reinventing forms and structures. in the most extraordinary way.
When I looked at the manuscript of 131 in Krakow, I remember I was allowed to take pictures. I was amazed I was allowed to take pictures on my phone.
Yes.
But I remember sending you his manuscript marking when he wrote espressivo over the top.
Yes, yes. I mean, these little clues are all we have, but they're very meaningful. There's a big difference, for instance, between espressivo and dolce. There's more intensity in espressivo. Dolce sometimes has a sense of innocent, childlike, tender. I mean, I think there is not an appassionato element in dolce, but there is in espressivo.
Why do you think he didn't put any spaces between the movements, the 7 movements of 131? Is it to I mean, he was undergoing a major sort of intense crisis in his own life when he was writing it.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think he achieved by that? How did he feel his way towards it?
I think the sense of the unity between movements is just growing and growing in Beethoven. One emotion just leads to another somehow, absolutely automatically. And there is a gain in intensity in not having these little links. He shows you almost he takes you into his studio and shows you what he's doing sometimes. The movements were simply chapters, very linked chapters, where almost the beginning of the new chapter always refers back to the end of the previous chapter.
Mm-hmm. And Schubert learned a lot from 131. I mean, well, he heard it on his deathbed, didn't he, more or less? I mean, he thought it was some of the greatest he'd ever heard.
I'm trying to think that way. I mean, actually, there's also a deathbed story of Beethoven doesn't hear, but reads manuscripts of Schubert songs on Beethoven's deathbed, and is, I mean, absolutely totally bowled over by these, and says things like, "Oh yes, I would have set this Goethe poem in exactly the same way," and he has the divine spark, and so on.
Sadly, didn't know that.
Yes, I mean, Schubert, I think, didn't know that, and Schubert was in awe of Beethoven, just would go to the inn and sit and listen to him talk with his friends without daring to introduce himself. It was a pallbearer at Beethoven's funeral. But actually, sadly, although he died only a year after Beethoven, they didn't, as far as we know, they didn't meet or interact, which is what a tragedy that is.
Yes, what a tragedy.
They would have been soulmates.
He had a tremendous sense of audience, didn't he? And but then that must have got so skewed by his deafness.
Yes, and no, absolutely. I mean, it's very hard to imagine both his emotional life and his compositional life, and I mean, he's performing. There are awful stories of him. I mean, he had to stop performing, but the story of him conducting one of the symphonies for the first time and conducting away when the orchestra had finished ages,
the 9th symphony.
Was that the 9th?
It was the 9th. It was his first appearance on a stage for, I don't know, 10 years or something. And he went on conducting, but actually there was a conductor behind. That's what the orchestra was following. And he was ahead of them. And eventually the alto soloist had to turn him round so he saw everybody clapping.
That's terrible, isn't it? I mean, it's ridiculous and terrible. But I think we also have to say that, maybe in some ways the deafness brought him to his late quartets and late piano sonatas, because I think by then he was not composing for the audience. He was. I mean, he said at some point when someone complained it was difficult, that he said this is not for you, it's for future generations. And he knew he would be understood one day, but there were no restrictions. He wasn't trying to please, he wasn't trying to be understood, he wasn't trying to make money. He could just compose in his innermost soul and follow his fantasy to his most extreme places, and be completely impractical instrumentally and vocally and all those things. And none of those things, he wasn't hemmed in by any requirements of practicability or financial or what the audience might think. And in a way that must have given him a freedom, an extraordinary degree of freedom, which is quite rare, and maybe that was one of the factors contributing to the extraordinary, the real uniqueness of his late period, which no one has. I mean, Beethoven influenced lots of composers, but it was more the middle period which is influenced. Nobody could carry on from the late period. Really.
Yeah.
I mean, I think possibly Bartok was in a way very influenced by it, but in the tonal period of the 19th century, nobody could continue from there.
In January 1827, just after his 56th birthday, Beethoven took to his bed. He was looked after by friends, and for 3 months he lay there, receiving friends and writing letters. And then, in a snowstorm in March, he died. Vienna was brought to a standstill by the tens of thousands of people crowding after his funeral. And the poem I wrote on his end invokes the autopsy which he'd asked for. He wanted them to find the cause of his deafness. I don't know if they did, but this poem is really about the hope with which he ended every piece, however suffering, however poignant, however tragic it was. And as a reminder that he wrote for us all, he wrote for humanity. Musica humana. The auditory canal covered in glutinous scales, shining through the autopsy. The auditory arteries thick, cartilaginous as if stretched over a raven's quill. And the auditory nerve withered to a pure white strand. But reading the last page in the book of his life on earth, how he joked with the doctor who lanced his belly, gallons of fluid rushing across the floor. You remind me of Moses striking the rock with his staff. How he laughed when he could. How he read with great joy, he said, a 40-volume set of all the works of Handel. And how he died, lifting his fist, as if it held a bird he would release into the storm, pelting Vienna with snow, like the reckless feathers driving all our lives to seek the fullest experience of the air. I hear the unquenchable spirit that powers every note he writes and lives on, dancing, dancing in you, me, everyone.
Thank you, Ruth and Karl, for this wonderful journey over 4 days with poetry and music that have taken us through the life and work of Beethoven, culminating in his extraordinary late style. Thanks also to our guest artists, soprano Nina Kanter, cellist David Waterman and the Endellion String Quartet, and the South Asian Symphony Orchestra and Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao. Thanks to our audience for watching, and do join us for the live session where Ruth and Karl will respond to questions.